Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who is a special advisor to the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Yes, I was. Hello.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
We're dialing it up to 15 because I've been awake for 12 hours at this point and it's 20 to 4 in the afternoon. Joe, welcome back from your honeymoon.
Hello. Oh, it's lovely to see you guys. I missed you, but I spent time with other animals, not political types, but just real animals instead.
You saw all the big five on your safari, didn't you, I think?
In the first 24 hours. I even saw a tortoise. Who knew there was a tortoise in Africa that you would see? And then they said, it's going to rain in a couple of days, and then it rained the next day. So,
well, because you saw a tortoise.
Tortoises come out when it's going to rain, apparently it's a sign.
Whoa.
But I have literally come out of like a real life The Lion King movie. Like I spent most of my time singing bits of The Lion King, and then my husband actually ate Pumbaa. The chef said, tonight we're going to eat Pumbaa, and we all looked and he went, warthog. And I was like, no, you can't. But he did. Apparently it tastes like pork, but I couldn't do it.
Hakuna Matata, mate.
Well, yeah, not for... Well.
When I was a young warthog.
That's what I kept singing over dinner.
Well, it's lovely to have you back, Joe. I'm pleased that you've completed your first voyage into town on your moped as well today.
Yeah, I did. I actually went past Parliament today and I felt proper smug. I'm in the joys of menopause, and they say that as you get older, you get scared of driving like late at night, even in roads you know really well. So the fact that I managed to get up early and go in on my little electric moped, complete with my snow leopard helmet, and got back again in one piece, I am thrilled to bits. I feel like I've had a major achievement at the age of 48.
Well, you know why? That's because you were born to be wild.
Oh, dear. It's lovely to have...
We should have a jingle there rather than forcing me to inflict my terrible voice on people.
It's turned into a karaoke episode of the Whitehall Sources pod. Kirsty, I know that you wanted to reflect on the death of Martin Townsend as well as we begin today.
Yes. I've had a lot of the Sunday Express crew met up last night. And we met up to pay tribute to Martin Townsend, who was the editor of the Sunday Express. I'm sure lots of people have got very stereotypical views of what a tabloid editor is like, very sweary, very shouty. Martin couldn't have been further from a stereotype if you tried it. He was an incredibly gentle, kind-hearted, very, very funny guy. He started off as a reporter doing kind of entertainment, so he had a lot of very funny stories about various run-ins with various very famous pop stars. So I just wanted to sort of, people have an idea of what newspapers are like. He championed better mental health support in the workplace long before it was fashionable. At least 4 female political editors owe their kind of big break to Martin. He championed women into roles that, were more often the preserve of men. And he will be greatly, greatly missed. He was a very, very entertaining, very funny, very kind and thoughtful guy. And there will be at some point a memorial to him at Brides, which is the church in Fleet Street for journalists, and I'm sure it will be absolutely packed.
Yeah,
as it should be.
As it should be, indeed. Thanks, Kirsty. Appreciate that. Right, welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast. Lots to consider today. Later in the pod, actually, we're doing a bit of a focus on the Green Party. They've got a new leader, Zack Polanski, and he has turned up the volume of this, well, I suppose what was once considered a protest vote. Is that still an applicable label? We'll be speaking to one of their councillors, the northwest of England, and we'll hear from a pollster as well to talk a bit more about what seems to be a bit of a surge in popularity. But we want to start the podcast today with the latest on the Grooming Gangs Well, scandal, fallout around the inquiry. The second of two candidates lined up to chair the Grooming Gangs Inquiry has resigned after victims said they'd lost faith in the process. This is Jim Gamble, who's the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, who confirmed he would stand down. This followed 4 survivors resigning from a panel set up to involve them in the process. And that comes after the Prime Minister announced Baroness Casey will, quote, support the work of the Grooming Gangs Inquiry and, quote, get to the truth. He announced that at Prime Minister's Questions today. I was there in Parliament, in the chamber, watching it happen. And afterwards, the journalists were really pushing for answers as to, first of all, when Baroness Casey was approached to, quote, support the work of the grooming gangs. There was no answer to that. It was also ill-defined, if I may be so bold, as to what supporting the work actually means for Baroness Casey, who, let's not forget, is already probably the busiest woman in Westminster and in Whitehall. Kirsty, the fallout from this continues. The fact is that 4 survivors, victims of the grooming gangs, have quit, saying that they don't trust the process. And specifically, at least one of them has called for the resignation of Jess Phillips, who is the minister kind of in charge of getting this inquiry up and running. Will this process survive?
It has to survive is the simple answer to that. It has to be turned around. The government has to work to regain the trust of many of the victims of abuse. But it's going to be a very long road back, and how they do it, I am uncertain. We had this extraordinary exchange at the dispatch box yesterday where the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, said that claims from some of the survivors that there had been an attempt to dilute the process, and rather than it just concentrating on the grooming gangs, that there was a question about whether they wanted to widen the scope of the inquiry out, was misinformation. Now that has, rightly or wrongly, that has been read by some of the survivors who are on the panel as accusing them of lying about this. And of course, one of the survivors of that panel has got the receipts, if you like. There is a consultation document that asks just this question. So, we will wait and see whether Jess Phillips feels that she's become too much of a distraction and that she feels that she has to resign. I absolutely don't think that Keir Starmer would want to sack her. She has spent her lifetime working for women victims of abuse and violence, but it was a tone deaf appearance yesterday, and I'm sure she didn't mean to imply that, but that's how it's been read, and I just don't know how you get back from it. It is possible to turn these things around. Obviously, when I worked at Number 10. And the former Prime Minister Theresa May has admitted that she should have gone to Grenfell sooner. She should have met the victims of Grenfell sooner. And when you think about that initial kind of contact between her as Prime Minister and the families of Grenfell, you would have thought that there would just be no coming back from that. But actually, she worked very, very hard on building trust and confidence with the Grenfell families. We had a specific person at Number 10 who spoke to them, almost probably on a daily basis, so that they knew that there was one kind of point person they could always come to at Number 10 with any issues that they had at all. And the Prime Minister would always make it a priority where they were involved. And ultimately that trust was built. So it is possible to turn it all around, but from here it's going to be a very long road.
I should say as well, just in the interests of completeness, that there are 2 other survivors as part of this panel. They are Samantha Walker-Roberts and Carly, who have told the BBC that they will stay on the panel and they disagree with those who have quit. Joe, this was what Kemi Badenoch went on at Prime Minister's Questions today. She was quoting those people who have stood down from the panel, telling Sir Keir Starmer they believe the inquiry would, quote, downplay the racial and religious motivations behind their abuse, and asked the Prime Minister, aren't the victims right when they call it a cover-up? It just doesn't look good, this, does it? But as Kirsty says, perhaps there is a way back.
I mean, they have failed to handle this whole issue very well from the start. It's gone all over the place. It's been, political hay has been made of the handling of the issue, whether there would be an inquiry in the first place, and now the fact that what's gone on or appears to have gone on with this inquiry. If I was Jess Phillips, I'd be turning up at the door of these individuals that are concerned, and I would be doing everything to get them back on side. And actually, if I think about the Jess Phillips, I know it's actually the kind of thing she would do. I think it would be devastating if Jess were to leave her post, because I do actually think she really does care about this, and maybe there was something a bit misguided in how she spoke or what she was trying to get across versus how it was interpreted. I think, Kirsty, you're absolutely right. There are specifics that the individuals can point to that show that there was concern about where this inquiry was going. But also, in the midst of all this, I have to say, we have to put a bit of a spotlight on Baroness Casey. Louise Casey is becoming Superman. She is literally, at the drop of a hat, she's expected to not quite put her knickers on the outside of her outfit, but she is riding into the rescue of this government repeatedly. She's been called upon by previous governments. I don't understand how that woman is able to function, because she's pretty much taking on umpteen what are almost full-time jobs by the sounds of it. With the review she was already doing in social care, she was doing stuff previously, doing the reports. She's done several reports. These are things that take up a lot of time, and these are people that are not elected and are doing this work because they think it matters, but they're not on an official payroll. They're on, she's a member of the House of Lords. We have to think about how we make sure that these people are fully resourced and equipped to do the important work that they're doing, because that woman in particular, we need to clone her, because she's being brought out for every problem of this sort of magnitude. It's like, where's Louise Casey? Paging Louise Casey. If she changes her phone number, we're all screwed.
Yeah.
I think the thing with Louise is she's very good at the diagnosis of a problem. I think where things fall apart is where somebody else has to deliver on the answers to the problem. I am slightly reminded, listening to Keir Starmer reference her name about 42,000 times at PMQs today. If anyone had Louise Casey on their PMQs bingo, they'd have had a full house very quickly. There was an exchange last week about the China spy scandal, where some rather hapless junior minister was thrown to the wolves and was in the dispatch box having a very uncomfortable hour, where he was trying to have everyone believe that the Deputy National Security Advisor, Matthew Collins, had unilaterally decided to, in terms, downgrade the threat represented by China without bothering to talk to anybody about it, and had unilaterally decided to sit back and do nothing while the CPS said, look, if you do nothing, this case is going to collapse, this espionage trial. And at the end of it, Tom Tugendhat, who's a former security minister himself, Conservative MP, rather wryly stood up and said, well, look, all us MPs and ministers might as well go home if, there is no need for senior civil servants to talk to ministers and to take these unilateral decisions. And I'm slightly reminded of that with Louise Casey. We have a massive, I think it's gone up, I can't remember what it's gone up by, but exponentially since COVID, the civil service has gone up to all nudging about 500,000.
It's around 500,000.
500,000 people, and it seems to entirely run around the fact that if Louise Casey isn't involved in it, nothing really gets done. I just find it absolutely extraordinary.
It's a very fragile position to be in, isn't it?
It's a very dangerous one as well. In the week where we've read stories about Chris Wormold as was appointed the cabinet secretary by Keir Starmer, to universal confusion, because a government once comes in, it wants to effect a lot of change. It appoints a cabinet secretary, and for people that don't know, cabinet secretary is like the number one civil servant. And he is responsible for driving the government's agenda right across every department. Chris Wormold, was always going to be a problematic choice because he's the quintessence of establishment. It's a very safe pair of hands at a time where you slightly wanted someone to be a bit kind of more bam-bam. There were other choices, slightly more radical choices that Starmer didn't go for. And now we read that obviously, the knives are out for Wormold. He probably won't survive for much longer. He'll be yet another person pushed, jettisoned from Number 10's, ever increasing revolving door. And I wonder whether actually Louise Casey will be the one that will find herself moved into a position where in turns she's asked to take up the role of driving the agenda right across government. If I were her, I would pick up my little bag and run so fast and make your head spin, because this is not a project. She won't, because she's a dedicated, wonderful woman and a dedicated public servant. But in terms of her own personal reputation, this is not a project I want to get aligned to right now.
Yeah.
If I were her.
Well, yeah, fair. I think it'd be tricky to pick it up and run with it, as you say.
My
Joe,
advice, Louise, run away.
Yeah, go in the other direction.
I do
exactly.
think we don't want her to change her phone number, but on the other hand, I think for her own sanity, maybe she should.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point about that as well. She's leading really important work, and actually, I assume she is only human, and so trying to do it all extremely well is going to get quite difficult.
And
quite
also
quickly.
unpaid. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think you get,
Yeah.
Lots of people that run public inquiries are like ex-judges that are, very wealthy, and they have other interests. But I don't know, how do you actually function when that's what you're doing? It's a genuine problem. Like, where you are potentially taking advantage in a significant way.
And back to the inquiry, it is very hard to see how you run this inquiry without it now being a judge-led inquiry, which is what the Conservatives have called for. I didn't really understand Keir Starmer's rationale at PMQs about why it couldn't be a judge-led inquiry. We've had plenty of judge-led inquiries before. It doesn't hinder, concurrent criminal cases going ahead. I don't see why that would be the case now. And the difficulty we've seen with the two people that were put forward to be a potential chair for an inquiry, one was a social worker and one's background was in policing. Now, who was at the front line of allowing these girls to continue to be abused was social workers and the police. Their trust in these organisations are at all-time low. So I think, rough hew it how they will, it's probably going to have to be a judge-led inquiry.
Yeah. Thank you both for thoughts on that. Lots still to come on the Whitehall Sources podcast. We're going to do a deep dive into the rise of the Green Party in the next few minutes. You can find us on YouTube if you'd like to watch the podcast in all of its glory. Just search for Whitehall Sources. Press subscribe while you're there. You can also find Holyrood Sources, Stormont Sources and Senedd Sources on YouTube and on your podcast app to get the lowdown from Scotland, Northern Ireland and, crucially, Wales as well at this moment in time. Find them on your podcast app or on YouTube. And as you're listening to us on Whitehall Sources, WhatsApp us with your questions, your thoughts, your analysis. The number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall. Lots more to come. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to the Whitehall Sources podcast. Thank you so much for being with us this week. Now, we want to go on to consider the position of the Green Party. Zack Polanski was elected leader of the Green Party last month, September 2025. Kirsty, I want to just put to you, first of all, before we welcome our special guests onto the podcast, I feel like since Polanski was elected as leader, the way I'm describing it is the volume of the Green Party seems to have turned up. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, he's got first mover advantage, hasn't he, on the left of Labour? I think I always said that, if Labour ever faced a populist party from the left with a kind of charismatic leader, then they might be in more trouble than they thought on that side. And I'd always thought a kind of good socialist like Mick Lynch, but Zack Polanski has moved into that space, and clearly around issues around welfare reform or wealth taxes, around Gaza, they've managed to put lots of red water, if you like, between them and a pretty moderate centrist government, and we've seen them sort of creep up in the polls to a position where they're going to be causing real problems for Labour, not just in splitting the left vote, although that obviously will be a problem, but actually in a position where they might, depending on how they choose to target seats, they might actually end up taking even more seats off Labour than they had at the last general election.
Which is a fascinating context. Right, in a moment we'll be speaking to a Green Party councillor. But first I want to welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast Luke Tryl, director of the pollsters More in Common. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
How good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Right, tell us then the state of play for the Green Party as things stand.
Well, just building off what Kirsty was saying, since Zack Polanski became leader, it looks like the party is enjoying somewhat of a boomlet in terms of their support. That's a technical polling term
Nice.
for it. They're averaging, they're up from sort of around 9-10% on average to 13-14%. There was a poll last week, admittedly, this was an outlier, which had them tied with the Labour Party. But in this week's YouGov poll, they hit 15%. That is the highest that pollster has recorded for them. We have them slightly lower, but still a high above 10%. So there is no doubt that something has happened since the election of Zack Polanski. And I think actually what you're seeing is the sort of latent progressive disillusionment with this Labour government breaking through now. In fact, I always thought it was slightly strange that, given Labour's struggles in their first year, that the Greens weren't already doing better. I'd sort of imagined that they would start to play the role that the Liberal Democrats played, for instance, during the Blair era, of becoming a repository for left-wing discontent. And I think the difficulty they had up till now was we are in what is sort of grandly known as the attention economy, where it is the people who can cut through and make the most noise that get recognised by voters. I think the previous co-leadership struggled with that. Zack Polanski clearly does not struggle with that and is very good. And in fact, in some ways, I'm sure he wouldn't welcome the comparison, but his approach to sort of being everywhere, what was it? Everything Everywhere All at Once, was that the film? Somewhat mirrors actually Nigel Farage's approach. And Nigel Farage over the summer, with those weekly press conferences whilst everyone else was on holiday. And it is meaning that he's cutting through. It looks like they are taking the biggest chunk of their voters, as you might imagine, from former Labour supporters. And that puts Labour in really big trouble, because it means what we're seeing is a mirror of what happened to Boris Johnson's coalition in 2019, where you had a chunk going to Labour, a chunk going to the Lib Dems, and a chunk going to Reform. You're seeing the same with Labour. They're losing votes to Reform on the right, the Greens on the left, and the Liberal Democrats.
That's fascinating. And the other part of this, I suppose, is who the Greens are attracting. So the types of voters, what do we know about that?
In particular, it looks like they are attracting younger voters, and in particular, young women. And what we're seeing in the UK is a mirror of what you have seen in some other Western democracies, where more young men are turning to parties of the populist right, young women actually turning to the Greens, and we have the Greens ahead amongst Gen Z women. Also in our polling at the moment, we find the Greens are doing very well amongst the most financially insecure group in society. So those who say that they often struggle to make ends meet, they are doing very well with that group. And I think what that suggests to me is, again, to make the comparison with Reform, they are getting the most support from those voters who think the social contract isn't working for them, and that we need something radically different. And I think we've discussed before, Calum, the sense that, yes, left versus right is an important axis of competition, but just as important now, given how unhappy so many people are with the status quo, is pro-system and anti-system. And if you think about our politics now, you've basically got Labour as the pro-system left, the Liberal Democrats, the Tories as pro-system right, Reform as anti-system right, and the Greens picking up that anti-system left group. And as Kirsty alluded to, actually picking up lots of those voters that we thought might have gone to your party. In fact, it looked, when we did hypothetical polling, like your party could sort of be a kind of death knell for the Greens. In fact, the reverse has happened. In our tracking, support for other and your party has gone down as the Greens have gone up. So they're very much benefiting from that kind of, that group of people who say, this isn't working for me. I want something different. Some people are rolling the dice on Reform UK, some on the Greens. And of course, there is a group of voters, which listeners might find difficult to imagine, who are actually Reform Green switchers. They are the group of people who say, I just want something different. Who is best placed to offer that to me?
I find that part really interesting as well, Luke. And the other thing I suppose that I'm thinking about here is whether the level of Green support that we've seen in kind of local council elections, combined with this kind of polling that you're witnessing, what it could mean electorally at some point. Are the Greens likely to be victims of a first-past-the-post voting system?
Well, I think I'll come on to that, but I think there's an important thing to remember here, that if you think of, again, I'll make that comparison, probably the most influential politician over the past 15 years has been Nigel Farage. And up until this parliament, he was never a serious contender for power. You can have outsized influence by putting pressure on the other political parties, which is what UKIP, the Brexit Party, and Reform UK did up until quite recently. So I think the Greens could shape the agenda in the debate, particularly on economics and the rigged system, even without winning seats. If we come back to sort of parliamentary arithmetic, I guess there are a couple of things here. One is part of the way they will be able to exert pressure is there is no doubt that even without winning seats in some of those, what I think we would have called Labour-Tory marginals, I suspect are now Labour Reform marginals, if the Greens get a significant chunk of the vote there, that would make it easier for Reform UK to win. And I think Labour is going to have to think about what it offers those progressive voters to try and woo them back. But I think, secondly, there's a whole raft of seats, in particular, inner cities, student seats, where the Greens could well win outright, there's sort of 30 or 40 of those seats. And you've seen the model for it in Bristol Central right there. And I think the Greens will be looking to replicate that. Obviously, there are parts of Manchester. In fact, I think Lucy Powell's seat is one where the Greens are quite strong contenders, parts of Sheffield as well. And then the third element is whether the Greens can gain support in some of those areas with particularly high Muslim population where people have voted for Gaza independence, because obviously the Greens have a very explicitly, I think it's fair to say, pro-Gaza platform, which is quite distinct from the other parties. And so I would expect the Greens to do well amongst those types of seats as well.
What can we say as well, Luke, about issues? So things like climate, of course, things like the economy, things like defence. How do these issues play with Green voters / those who may be tempted to vote Green?
Yeah, so I think, again, Polanski's economic messaging, I think more than anything else, is what is powering the rise of the Greens at the moment. The talk about the sort of rigged system. There are, you can debate the efficacy of wealth taxes. We're not going to get into that, but there's no doubt that there is significant appetite for them amongst a chunk of the electorate. And again, amongst a chunk of the electorate, an appetite for quite a different defence policy. And indeed, some of the comments that Zack Polanski has made about the monarchy will appeal to some voters. I suspect that those latter two issues are more issues which place a ceiling on Green support. They attract certainly the highly motivated base, but they probably make it more difficult to win swing voters. I think the economic messaging actually can have quite wide appeal. And of course, if you ask people why they're voting Green, climate and environment is still the number one top reason for voting for the Greens. I think maybe the challenge for, as I say, I think, Polanski, by any account, as a pollster, I think I'm able to say has had a very good start and is cutting through. I think maybe the challenge might be once you hit that kind of 15%, once you kind of mop up a lot of those disillusioned progressives, is his ceiling lower because he has less appeal to what I call those people that sort of basically vote for the Greens because they think they're nice. And we saw that, in places like Waveney Valley, in places like Herefordshire, the seat that the Greens won there. Actually, former Tory voters who were like, no, I want a party that's going to protect nature and the natural environment. Even if I'm quite small C conservative myself, I wonder if that group of people might be a bit more deterred, and if in fact Polanski has made quite an explicit, and I think sensible, to get the Greens momentum for where they want to go, trade between that group of voters and the newer voters he's bringing in.
Luke, what happens then if your party get their act together? So Zack Polanski has positioned this party on the flanks rather than anywhere near the centre. If your party get their act together at some point, are they not just going to start eating away at that 15%?
I think they definitely could. And look, there is some talk about, there would be a deal in terms of seats. I have to say, the electorate tend to find that sort of thing slightly confusing. And I wonder whether actually, when you think about a sort of deal, whether the Green Party would want to tie itself to some of the baggage that comes with a sort of Corbyn return to the fore and some of the other issues. Whereas actually, one of the big advantages of Polanski is he presents somewhat of a blank slate. He's part of a new generation of politicians. And had you asked me 3 months ago, before your party 1, 2, or 3 various splits, I would have said that the Greens would have to do a deal. I now actually think it might be in the Greens' interest to say, we're the dominant party of the left. There may be some areas where we cooperate, but actually, get on board with us. And I slightly wonder, and this is pure speculation, whether some of the sort of founder members of your party are not thinking, maybe we should have joined the Greens.
And where does this leave Labour? Because obviously Labour's entire political strategy is to tack to the right and to sort of try and stave off the threat from reform. It's not going to be able to tack this far to the left and that far to the right at the same time without falling between two stools, right?
Well, look, I do think, and I said this before the rise of the Greens, I think that Labour made a mistake in thinking that progressive voters had nowhere to go other than to back Labour. And I do think perhaps it's fair to say that at times they seem to take a bit of glee in progressive bashing and saying, that's not who we are now. That said, sometimes I think you can overthink this stuff, right? And if I were Labour, I think, I would stop all of the anti-climate briefing that is coming out at the moment and actually decide, look, we have to own this agenda, because rather than treating it as a sort of necessary evil. But I do think that so much of the fate of insurgent parties comes down to how people are feeling in 4 years' time, right? Like the thing which I come back to time and time again is, the woman who said to me, I can't even go for fish and chips every now and again. It's too expensive to have a little treat like that. If people start to feel like their lives are more manageable and a bit less miserable, they will turn back to the mainstream. If they don't, they will conclude that mainstream politics has failed, and it is time to give parties like the Greens, like Reform, maybe your party, depending on where they're up, a go. So I think just so much depends on that, do I have anything left over at the end of the month for some of the fun stuff in life test?
For clarity, it's not our party. It'll be Jeremy Corbyn or Zara Sultana's party or someone else's party. Who knows? Luke, thank you very much. That is the perfect primer for our conversation on the Greens. Really appreciate you joining us. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
That was Luke Tryl from More in Common. Joe, I think a question just to put to you on that's really interesting from Luke is this kind of comparison that he made with Nigel Farage, which was that political debate was shifted by Farage. His various parties had a huge impact on what Luke kind of refers to as the centre of gravity of political discussion before they became anywhere close to power, really. Farage's personal breakthrough, of course, in UK politics, really in terms of representation, was last year. So I wonder if there's something in that for the Greens, that they are challengers to Labour's left in many seats, that actually once support reaches a particular level for the Greens, they can have a significant impact on politics and the behaviour of the governing party without actually having to drastically increase their seat representation.
Yeah, I think there is something in that. there's been a couple of interventions I've seen online about how much the polls are actually driving the debate generally, in that, you know, a significant intervention, particularly from Farage, has definitely shifted the debate. But I guess Zack has the sort of benefit of being the new kid on the block. And in some respects, the fact that Farage has managed to dominate the debate sort of gives the suggestion, given where the polls are, that other parties do have an opportunity to kind of get ahead of the traditional establishment parties. So I think from the perspective the Greens have got, yes, they can potentially get into some quite interesting areas. The problem, I suppose, fundamentally for any political party when you're still pretty small, is you still need significant might, numbers of people to be able to sort of satisfy the media appetite, to be able to have enough voices out there, not to just be a sort of one-man band. Now, to be fair, Farage has done a pretty good job of being a one-man band for a significant amount of time, but you can see that Reform are using more of their bench more widely. And I guess from the point of view for the Greens is, you know, how can they deploy their bench effectively? But also, when you're on limited resources, how can you make sure you're pretty joined up and anything you are putting out there is pretty solid, coherent, and has got some basis to it? So I guess that is part of the challenge, Hannah, that the party's got.
Yeah, well, let's welcome Hannah into the conversation. Hannah Spencer, Green Party councillor for Hale and leader of the Greens on Trafford Council, as well as being their spokesperson for migration and refugee support. Hannah, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Not at all. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you. I think there's lots to reflect on from what we've all heard from Luke over the last few minutes. But I wonder if I could put it to you as an elected councillor for the Greens as to what you think differentiates the Greens from other parties. What is the offer?
I think it's very much that we are demonstrating that we're clearly in touch with the majority of people that live in this country. And I think we've seen a complete failure of politicians over the last few years to actually listen to the needs of people and then act on it. And I think that's why we're seeing, you know, as we've just been discussing, so many different types of people and voter groups and whatever background you're from, all coming towards the Greens.
Yeah. What do you think it is that's won you your seat on the council? You know, what was your pitch when you were campaigning?
So I think people really needed honesty in politics. People really respected that we were campaigning to be elected and we were being honest about what we could achieve. We were not promising all these huge things that was beyond our control. We were really clear with people about what we wanted to do and what we could do. And I think people really found that very refreshing. We always tell the truth, which I think people have forgotten that politicians are able to do, which I think really cut through to a lot of people. And it's interesting going back to, I suppose, what we were saying before about where we're winning seats. Like, we're winning them from each different party in a whole host of backgrounds. And I think Hale is a really clear example of somewhere that's always been conservative, now has 3 Green councillors. And like, you know, it is typically a much more wealthy area than some of the surrounding parts. But one thing that people kept saying to us during, you know, the energy bill price rises was people were saying to us, you know, if I'm noticing my prices and bills going up, like, what is it like for people who have less than me? And I think, yes, like the climate is really, really important to people, but so is social justice. And that is something that we see across all groups in society. People, you know, want a better life for people who are struggling.
I suppose in some ways, the Greens might still be viewed as something of a protest vote. And I wonder if there is work to be done there, Hannah. Luke's made the comparison to Reform UK, which I think probably still are something of a protest vote. You know, people feel it's just their turn. They've tried the rest, so let's give them a shot. Is that your feeling? Is it a protest vote?
Not at all. I think now we've shown that we have a track record, nearly 1,000 councillors, and we're showing that we can work hard when we're trusted with people's vote. I think it's interesting. I know sort of more from my background, my job, like I work in the construction industry with a lot of different types of people with all different views. And I really noticed that shift last year of people who were like me a few years ago, like not political at all, suddenly became interested in politics. And undoubtedly that was because of people like Nigel Farage. Like, finally, you know, people were sort of felt like somebody might have something. Very quickly that has fallen away, and people that I speak to tell me Reform don't have anything to actually offer, like beyond the sound bites and the 3-word slogans. there's nothing else there. And I think so many people, I know me and a lot of people like me, might be made to feel like we're quite stupid, but we're not daft. And we can see, actually, if you start to lift the lid a bit of what these people are saying, there's not really much to it. So I think, people who have become very fed up with politics, or maybe people who've never been into politics at all, suddenly last year did get that feeling of maybe something is shifting, realised it's not going to be reform, and are now coming towards the Greens.
Yeah. That point of depth is a good one. Go on, Kirsty.
No, I was just, I was thinking about what you were saying about cost of living. Now, obviously, net zero is becoming, and the pace and scale of change is becoming quite a hot political issue again. Now, obviously, Ed Miliband promised that the onwards march towards electrification would cut everyone's bills by £300, and the opposite is actually turning out to be true. Are you finding any problem on the doorstep with people actually saying, green policies are hitting us in our pockets? We like the idea, but it's costing us money.
No, I think, again, sort of quite the opposite. When we talk to people, again, the conversations really started to increase when we all saw our bills go up. We have some of the leakiest homes in Europe. I work in some of the leakiest homes. I can see myself, like, it's absolutely ludicrous if I'm having to do a calculation to fit a heating system and I'm having to do a heat loss and half the heat or whatever is just going out of the house. That message is definitely with people. Like, why are we paying to heat these houses when half or whatever the heat is just going out of the building? So I think actually the common sense approach that people want is, well, it would be cheaper no matter which heating source we're going to use. If we can just reduce the amount of heat that's needed to heat our homes, then that is going to impact people almost immediately. It will create green jobs, well-paid green jobs for people who need them. And yeah, again, I think it's one of those areas again where reform can have these taglines or whatever it is that they're saying. But actually, when you chat to people really, really understand that, yeah, there is a need to make our houses more efficient and to reduce our bills.
I think the question that sits behind that is one of luxury beliefs. Is the Green Party actually gaining, in essence, the bulk of what used to be Corbyn support, which is split along class divides as opposed to any other divide? So it's a youth vote, but it's not a kind of rural vote, and it's not a working class vote.
I would disagree, yeah, because I think, again, like, my background is much more I grew up in Bolton, a very working class town, which I'm very proud of now, but I think anyone growing up somewhere like that, you're often made to feel like it's a bad thing living somewhere like that. And so I see now, again, a lot of people that I grew up with and a lot of people that I know are now feeling like the Greens are the only option left, because we are, our policies do appeal to very broad groups of people. And I think, it's almost really difficult to say that there's one group that we appeal to most, because I do genuinely think it is such a broad range of people who are now coming to us.
I wonder, Hannah, to what extent, Zack Polanski is the reason for this conversation, for this kind of renewed sense of purpose for the Greens. And as I was referring to earlier, just this feeling that the volume is cranked up under Polanski's leadership. Do you credit him with that, with sort of in the month that he's been leader, really changing things for the party?
I think it's undoubtedly, he's done a fantastic job at getting that message out to people. And it's built on years of hard work. It's the foundations for this were built a very long time ago. And it's been people chipping away to get us to a point where Zack has been able to come and really lift us even further up. And it is absolutely, like, I can't tell you how many people, how often they're getting in touch with me, people that I've never had conversations with about politics before, are contacting me saying, like, I've joined the Green Party, or I've seen Zack on this, that and the other, and I'm like, that is really new, like, something has absolutely shifted. And I keep laughing as well, because I'm like, well, on the dating apps myself, I'm like, I don't talk about politics, but I can't tell you now, I can't get through a first date without somebody genuinely saying, what do you think about Zack? And I'm like, I haven't even mentioned the Green Party or anything at that point. And I'm like, wow, like, this is unbelievable.
Are you going to have to change it? Would you have to change your profile picture to you and Zack, maybe, just to kind of, he might have some extra curb appeal that you didn't realise.
Yeah, don't green, it makes you hot. I mean,
I might try that. I'll come back and I'll let you know how that goes. Yeah.
If we were to interrogate the data, Hannah, we'd have to ask how many first dates you've gone on where that's actually happened. But we shan't do
I'm
that.
trying to get any information out.
But I mean, that, Joel, that is interesting, and that, I think that is the Polanski effect. Now, whether this lasts, how long it goes on for, whether it transfers into kind of electoral success, remains to be seen. But you have to be loud in politics today, and he definitely is.
Well, yeah, and I think there's a personal aspect in that, I think more people could probably name the leader of the Greens now and would, whether they'd get the name completely right, but would probably get most of the way there, if not all of the way there. Because you know how it is when, I remember watching, I think I was listening actually to the New Times podcast, and they said that they'd asked people who Keir Starmer was in Liverpool, and someone said, "What's that?" They didn't even know it was a person. So you can never be quite sure about this as a sort of, really what's going on the street. However, there's no question that even from a media perspective, the Greens have been given more of a platform than they've had previously. I think Zack's sort of entering the frame meant that I think there's been a bit more interest, and I think the fact that he's a good performer has made it sort of easier for the Greens to kind of retain being invited in more to take part in stuff, because there's interest in what's being said, but also if you're delivering a pretty good message, if you're getting stuck into the debate, it's worthwhile having someone on. So I think from that point of view, there's probably a fair amount of weight on his shoulders, though, that he kind of can't screw up, because he's got them he's helped, I think, alongside the fact that your councillor numbers had gone up, I think it's got the Greens into the conversation. And there is something to be said for the fact there's so much interest in a much smaller party like Reform that I think even from a broadcast point of view, there is a bit more interest in kind of widening the group of people that are in conversations, that are taking part in debate, because I think there is a sense that this frustration with the traditional status quo sort of parties is very palpable, given where we are looking at in terms of polls and where we're looking at in terms of, the sort of online discourse about issues. So I think that's a massive sort of bonus for the Greens. But it does put individual pressure on Zack, because if he doesn't continue to sort of lead from the front, that could be a problem then for cut through for others within the party.
Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say, we're a slightly different setup really to a lot of parties where we're all elected into our positions internally. Zack will be up for re-election, and he is very aware of that. And I think now we've probably had that surge of people joining, like the next leaders of the party are just joining now, and I don't think anyone's going to take that for granted. But I think the really different thing about somebody like Zack is that, and I knew this from, I've worked on different things with him, and I knew from literally the day I met him, he was so interested in hearing about my struggles, my job, or whatever, like the things that make things hard for me and that I would want to change. And he is a real voice for a lot of people, and I just did not see that at all from anybody in politics. And I think an example of this week is I've had all my tools stolen this week, which is a very common occurrence for tradespeople.
Yeah.
Full inside tradespeople have their tools stolen. It's so
something
common.
We've reflected on this podcast, in fact, in the past.
Yeah, something that it's happened so often your insurance doesn't really cover it, and you just have to go out and buy new tools. I haven't even replaced the bulk of them, and it's cost me 900 quid, and I've lost work and all the rest of it. It's estimated to cost the economy, I think, in 2024 alone, £3 billion. Now, on the same day that my tools were stolen, the government announced that it was dropping plans to make it harder to sell stolen tools. They've arguably been lobbied by the manufacturers and the retailers, and they've sided with them. And I think, hang on a second, like the cost to the economy and the cost to people like me and to customers who end up paying the price, why is nobody thinking about that? Why is nobody thinking about the stress that I've had this week as I've tried to get back up on my feet to replace all this stuff? And I was proud that the Greens have already been campaigning on that. Ali Chowns is, she's campaigned on it. Zack was well aware of these issues. And I think this is where so many people like me who felt absolutely let down for such a long time and now come into a party that actually is really in touch with the people who make up the majority of the people in the UK.
Hannah, so good to speak to you. Sorry about the tool theft. That is really crap. There's absolutely no two ways about that, and I hope it resolves itself for you.
We need to call Jenrick in because he was off looking around markets trying to find them. So
I was about to say,
remember he
Hannah,
did a
if you-
video
if
on
you-
that, didn't he?
If you go to your market this weekend, you could probably buy your
Probably
own bloody
find him
tools
again,
back.
sadly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's such a shame. That's awful.
Yeah. But Hannah, thank you so much for your take, for your insight on the Green Party operation. It's great to have you on the pod.
Thank you so much for having me.